Off Samar Island, the escort carrier Gambier Bay is floundering. Her engine room floods, speed dropping to 11 knots, all while Japanese heavy cruiser Chikuma closes in for one final shot. Then, through the smoke and mist, the battered destroyer comes into view, half scarred with strange pink, green, and yellow stains. It's limping forward at half speed, and on what's left of its twisted bridge stands a man with his uniform torn completely off above the waist and 2 fingers missing from his left hand. He's shouting orders as Johnston turns toward Chikuma. His ship was all but lost, but now she's back and ready for more. At 6:45 a.m. on October 25th, 1944, a radio transmission crackled across the bridge of Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague's flagship. An anti-submarine patrol pilot's voice cut through the static, quote, "Enemy surface force of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 11 destroyers sighted 20 miles northwest of your task group and closing in on you at 30 knots. Despite the numbers, Rear Admiral Sprague, known as Ziggy to his peers, felt a sudden flash of irritation, believing some rookie pilot had botched his ship recognition. To him, this approaching force had to be friendly, probably units from Admiral William F. Halsey's enormous Third Fleet, tasked with protecting the upcoming Leyte invasion. According to intelligence, ships were supposed to be operating somewhere to the north, hunting Japanese carriers, and it made sense that some of his battleships might have detached south. Ziggy grabbed the squawk box and told his air operations officer to relay the message back to the pilot, verify his ID once more, then turn back to his busy routine. After all, he commanded Task Group 7743, called Taffy 3 by everyone aboard. This team, composed of 6 escort carriers, steamed in formation and screened by 3 destroyers and 4 smaller destroyer escorts, had been running air operations off Samar Island for 8 straight days, and was preparing for another long day of similar patrols and strikes ahead. After only 3 minutes, the pilot, Ensign William C. Brooks, was back again on the radio, his voice much sharper, confirming he'd seen the distinctive pagoda masts of Imperial Japanese Navy warships with his own eyes. At that same moment, dark bursts of anti-aircraft fire peppered the horizon to the northwest, from Japanese gunners shooting at the lone American scout, who quickly rolled into an attack run and released his only weapons, 2 depth charges designed for hunting submarines, utterly useless against armored cruisers. Rear Admiral Sprague stared at the northwestern horizon, where the anti-aircraft bursts still bloomed against the morning sky. Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force had taken a savage beating the day before in the Sibuyan Sea, with Halsey's carrier planes sinking the giant battleship Musashi and several other Japanese warships badly enough that Kurita turned his fleet around, apparently retreating west through the Philippines. Every single American commander had watched him go and assumed he was running for safety, with Halsey following suit. But those anti-aircraft bursts meant Japanese gunners were out there right now, shooting at an American scout. Kurita hadn't retreated at all. He'd slipped through the San Bernardino Strait during the night, and now Taffy 3 was all that stood between Kurita's guns and the invasion beaches. Seconds after Brooks verified the contact, spotters on Sprague's flagship caught sight of towering superstructures breaking over the northwestern horizon. Japanese cruisers and battleships, their pagoda masts unmistakable, bore down on Taffy 3. That morning, Rear Admiral Sprague commanded 6 escort carriers: Fanshawe Bay, Sunlo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Gambier Bay, and Kitkun Bay. Additionally, 7 screening vessels formed a thin protective ring around them. 3 destroyers, Heerman, Hull, and Johnston, along with 4 smaller destroyer escorts: Dennis, John C. Butler, Raymond, and Samuel B. Roberts. Sailors called these tin cans for good reason, as their hulls were lightly armored and their crews were mostly young men who had never faced enemy surface ships, only submarines. The heaviest weapons Taffy 3 possessed were 5-inch guns mounted on the destroyers and destroyer escorts. Each carrier carried a single 5-inch gun for self-defense. Against Kurita's fleet, these weapons were laughably inadequate, especially since, in addition to 4 battleships, the Empire had Yamato, Musashi's sister ship, mounting 9 18-inch rifles capable of hurling car-sized shells weighing over a ton apiece. At 6:58 a.m., those big guns opened fire, and massive shells screamed overhead and crashed into the sea, astern of the American carriers. As these towering columns of water erupted where each salvo landed, the sailors realized those weren't ordinary white splashes. Instead, geysers burst skyward in shades of pink, green, red, yellow, and purple, as each Japanese warship used differently colored dye packets loaded into their shells, allowing gunners to track which impacts belonged to which ship and adjust their aim accordingly. Sprague watched the rainbow plumes closing in, and later recalled that the splashes had a, quote, kind of horrid beauty. Beautiful or not, Ziggy knew those geysers marked an approaching Imperial force. One so powerful, he was sure his lightly built escort carriers would not survive more than 15 minutes under sustained fire. Without hesitation, Sprague barked orders across the flagship's bridge, and the entirety of Taffy 3 swung from its northern heading to due east, racing at maximum speed toward a rain squall forming on the horizon. 1 minute later, he commanded every ship to lay smoke, and thick chemical clouds poured from generators mounted on the sterns of the destroyers and escorts, while the carriers added their own black petroleum smoke from their stacks. Though this dense smoke wouldn't stop armor-piercing shells, right then, that rain squall and those smoke screens were the only protection Taffy 3 had. Unbeknownst to the increasingly worried Rear Admiral Sprague, his Japanese counterpart was having some harrowing thoughts of his own. Aboard Yamato, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita was just as stunned by the encounter. Though his lookout had also spotted the American ships at around the same time, nobody could tell what they were looking at. The carriers appeared large through the optical rangefinders. In the confusion of the morning light in the distance, Kurita's officers reported them as fleet carriers, possibly even units from Halsey's powerful Third Fleet, the very one that had savaged through his formation only the day before. With this gut-sinking feeling, Kurita made his ship shift from their cruising columns and issued a general attack command, an order that released every ship to act independently, turning the engagement into a free-for-all. With this decision, instead of forming a proper battle line where his 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers could concentrate their massive firepower, Kurita's fleet scattered, with each captain choosing his own target and charging forward at maximum speed. Still unaware of the chaos and confusion rippling through the Japanese formation and seeing the enemy close in fast on his vulnerable carriers, just past 7 in the morning, Rear Admiral Sprague broadcast an urgent call for help. Admiral Thomas Stump, commanding Taffy 2, roughly 30 miles to the south, responded immediately, and his carriers began arming and launching every available aircraft to reinforce. A little bit further south, Taffy 1, under Admiral Thomas Sprague, no relation, also turned their planes north toward the fight, though they were 70 miles away. Over the radio, Stump's voice boomed with encouragement to his friend, quote, "Don't be alarmed, Ziggy. Don't do anything rash." From one moment to the next, the flight decks across Taffy 3's carriers erupted into activity. Fanshawe Bay catapulted her full complement of Grumman TBF Avengers armed with torpedoes, while White Plains launched her Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters first to clear the deck, then brought up bomb-laden Avengers as soon as the launch window opened. Through it all, the crews worked frantically like a well-oiled machine, arming planes with whatever ordnance was available, rolling them to the catapults and hurling them into the air as fast as they could. These Avengers went in alone or in pairs. There was no time to form up into proper attack formations. Pilots carried torpedoes when available, bombs when torpedoes ran out, even depth charges meant for submarines, all hoping they would scare away the Japanese. By 7:30 a.m., not even an hour after the first sighting, nearly every operational aircraft from Taffy 3 had clawed into the sky, swarming toward Kurita's formation like angry hornets defending their nest. Japanese heavy cruiser Suzuyo became one of the first targets when a series of Avengers dove through curtains of anti-aircraft fire and scored multiple hits that slowed the cruiser and forced her to fall back. As word spread across the radio nets, an hour later, nearly every aircraft in the Leyte Gulf area joined the assault. These attacks were frantic and improvised, with pilots dropping their bombs and torpedoes, diving at the massive warships with empty weapons bays, just to force Japanese gunners to keep shooting skyward instead of at the carriers. Even Gambier Bay's air group commander flew his aircraft for 2 hours straight after releasing his ordnance, while another pilot made 20 strafing runs that morning, half of them with completely empty guns, banking and weaving through flak just to keep the Japanese distracted. Though the attacks looked aggressive enough, the American pilots knew there were too few aircraft and too few ordnance to cause serious damage to an armored battleship. Still, Japanese officers saw things quite differently. According to one sailor, quote, "Even in comparison with the many experiences of American attacks we had already had, this was the most skillful work of your planes." While aircraft swarmed overhead, Rear Admiral Sprague, knowing he needed every weapon he had, ordered his lightly armed destroyers and escorts to attack Kurita's fleet. Commander Ernest E. Evans, skipper of USS Johnston, didn't wait for the other destroyers, sister ships Fletcher-class Heermann and Hull, all 3 barely a year old. The leader quickly picked his target, the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano, and opened fire, hurling more than 200 rounds from the ship's 5-inch guns at the enemy. With their radar-controlled Mark 37 fire control system, the computer fed precise targeting solutions directly to her gun crews, and Johnston's shells found their mark again and again. As expected, the Japanese warship returned fire immediately, and enormous colored geysers erupted around the charging destroyer. But Evans wasn't done. Instead, knowing he was on board the ship closest to the force, the skipper ordered a torpedo attack and pushed Johnston even closer toward Kumano. At 10,000 yards, he gave the command to launch all 10 torpedoes, their white wake streaking toward the massive cruiser. Seconds later, 2 heavy underwater explosions boomed across the water, making the Japanese ship shudder. Evans then reversed course and threw up a smokescreen as Johnston broke away, while both Kumano and the nearby cruiser Suzuya turned back, damaged and falling out of formation. But not even a minute later, the enemy guns finally found the American ship. 3 14-inch shells from a battleship and 3 6-inch rounds from a cruiser slammed into the destroyer in rapid succession, the impacts tearing massive holes through her thin hull, ripping apart the engine room, and sending seawater flooding into compartments below. Power to the steering engine was out instantly. 3 of her 5-inch guns went silent. The gyro compass shattered. Johnston's radar antenna snapped off its mast and crashed down onto the bridge, claiming 3 officers in the wreckage. The blast wave from the 14-inch shells was so violent that it even ripped every piece of clothing off Commander Evans above his waist and tore 2 fingers clean off his left hand. Below decks, sailors trapped in the flooding compartments were lost forever. Following this violent and rapid attack, Johnston's speed was down to 17 knots, barely half her maximum. All throughout her, fires raged aft, and water poured through from hull plates. By all rights, the destroyer should have rolled over and sunk right there. But she didn't. Instead, Evans, standing half-naked and somewhat injured on what was left of his bridge, called down to all stations through the smoke and sparking electrical systems, and one by one, from deep inside the battered ship, the responses all came back positive. Johnston was still in the fight. From there, the beleaguered battleship headed out into the same rain squall that had sheltered the carriers, allowing a 10-minute respite, where damage control teams worked frantically in the temporary cover, patching holes with whatever they could find and rerouting power through jury-rig connections. Everyone determined that by the time Johnston emerged from the squall, 3 of her 5-inch guns would be back in action. Seeing her sister hard at work, Hull selected her own target, the battleship Congo. Led by Commander Leon S. Kintberger, the destroyer opened fire at 14,000 yards. Congo fired back immediately, a shell slamming into Hull's bridge and disabling all voice and radio communication. More shells followed, knocking out the port engine, along with 3 guns, and jamming the rudder hard right. Before the crew could correct the steering, Hull found herself heading straight toward Congo, her forward guns still firing. Despite the damage, Kintberger refused to withdraw and launched his remaining 5 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Haguro, then tried to withdraw southwest, away from the Japanese guns. But with only 1 engine left, Hull was trapped between Congo, closing on one side, and heavy cruisers bearing down on the other, with no speed to escape. From there, according to one report, for more than an hour, quote, every Japanese ship within range took a crack at her. Hull zigzagged desperately, while her 2 remaining bow guns fired roughly 500 rounds at whatever enemy ship looked most threatening. Japanese shells rained down on the destroyer, riddling it with holes. Reportedly, the Japanese cruisers passed so close that the American crew could see enemy anti-aircraft gunners on their decks. When another shell hit right in the last engine, Hull stopped moving. Commander Kintberger had no choice but to give the order to abandon ship. Some crewmen stayed behind to prevent an explosion from the burning No. 1 magazine, while the rest evacuated. At 8:55 a.m., after everyone had left, Hull rolled over and sank. Now, Taffy 3 was down to a single functioning destroyer. In the midst of the chaos of Johnston and Hull, the 3rd sister ship, Heermann, was busy screening the carriers through smoke and rain, though Commander Amos T. Hathaway hadn't heard the original torpedo attack order. When the order finally reached him at 7:50, he charged through what remained of Taffy 3's formation at full speed. That morning, visibility was terrible, and twice Hathaway had to throw the engines into emergency reverse to avoid ramming friendly ships, narrowly missing 2. Once clear, however, Hathaway straightened his course and went straight for the nearest enemy warship, the heavy cruiser Haguro. Heermann opened fire and launched 7 torpedoes, but when all missed, the skipper decided to turn away and head towards something bigger, the battleships Congo and Haruna. Right behind them sat Yamato and Nagato, surrounding Heermann at basically every angle. Congo, Nagato, and Yamato opened fire simultaneously, with bright red, yellow, and green splashes erupting all around her. Through it all, Hathaway weaved through the colored geysers, closing the distance. Then, at only 4,400 yards from Haruna, close enough to see the battleship's superstructure clearly. He launched his last 3 torpedoes and broke away. 2 of those torpedoes missed Haruna and kept running, joined by 2 more torpedoes, likely fired earlier by Hull. Now, all 4 white wakes headed straight for Yamato, with 72,000 tons, 9 18-inch guns, and carrying armor thick enough to shrug off anything the Americans could throw at her. When lookouts aboard the massive battleship spotted them closing in, the world's largest battleship sheepishly turned hard and ran north, keeping that heading for 10 minutes to clear the torpedo tracks. Hirman's entire attack run, from charging through Taffy 3's carriers to breaking away from Haruna, lasted only 13 minutes, during all of which she endured endless fire from 3 Japanese battleships, cleverly maneuvering around them and emerging without a single major hit. However, most importantly, in that same span, this 2,000-ton destroyer had forced the most powerful warship ever built to flee the battle. Now, Kurita's biggest gun platform was gone when he needed it most. With Yamato out at the fight, Kurita grew more and more convinced that he'd stumbled into something far bigger than a handful of escort carriers. For his part, Rear Admiral Sprague, watching his destroyers get battered, made another desperate call and ordered his destroyer escorts, nicknamed Little Wolves, into the attack. These were even smaller vessels, and their crews had spent weeks on patrol, definitely not trading shots with cruisers. Nonetheless, Sprague gave the order for a second attack. One of them, Raymond, charged forward and went after Haguro, the lead Japanese cruiser. At 6,000 yards, she launched 3 torpedoes and immediately turned hard to escape, swerving and vanishing into smoke. Dennis followed right behind, firing her torpedoes at the nearest cruiser, either Chokai or Tone. Nobody was sure through all the haze. She turned sharply southwest, then opened fire with a rear gun on a cruiser already under air attack. For 7 straight minutes, Dennis traded shots with a much larger warship, before breaking away at high speed. All Little Wolves reversed course as soon as their torpedoes were away, laying more smoke and firing at whatever Japanese ship looked closest. Somehow, none of them took hits. Most surprisingly, despite all of them turning and swerving through narrow patches of ocean to dodge incoming salvos, there was not a single collision. By then, nobody on either side could see what was actually happening. Rain and clouds cut visibility to almost nothing. Smoke from dozens of ships turned the ocean into gray fog. Japanese officers had no idea what they were facing anymore. Japanese gunners were finding their targets now. Destroyer escort Dennis took a hit and withdrew, while Samuel B. Roberts, another destroyer escort, absorbed 2 14-inch shells from Congo that tore her open at the waterline, sinking less than an hour later. Though escort carrier Gambier Bay had dodged fire for 30 minutes, her luck ran out when shells holed her engine room and dropped her speed to 11 knots, forcing her to fall behind the formation, slowing and burning. Then Johnston, battered and down to half speed, came charging back into the fight. Commander Evans, seeing Gambier Bay falling behind and Japanese cruiser Chikuma closing in for the finish, ordered his gunnery officer to open fire. Johnston closed to 6,000 yards and landed 5 hits on the cruiser, trying desperately to pull her attention away from the vulnerable carrier. Nonetheless, Chikuma ignored the destroyer completely and kept hammering Gambier Bay. The other nearby Hirman tried the same tactic with no better luck. By 8:45 a.m., she was dead in the water, and only 15 minutes later, all while the enemy kept firing at her and her men trying to cling to whatever they could find in the water, Gambier Bay capsized and went under. Then Johnston turned away from the damage and spotted something worse. Japanese destroyers were forming up more than 10,000 yards out, maneuvering into position to launch a coordinated torpedo attack on the remaining carriers. Commander Evans didn't hesitate and opened fire immediately, charging straight toward them while his guns targeted the lead ship, which turned out to be the light cruiser Yahagi. Johnston's shells hammered into Yahagi roughly a dozen times as the battered American destroyer bore down on the Japanese formation. The Japanese squadron commander, watching this damaged but relentless destroyer charging at him through the smoke and chaos, made a critical mistake. Rattled by Johnston's aggressive attack, he gave the order to launch torpedoes far too early, with his target still 10,500 yards away, well beyond effective range. Yahagi fired 7 torpedoes, and the destroyers followed seconds later with their own spreads, all of them launched in sheer panic before Johnston could get any closer. Every single one of the torpedoes missed. One of the escort carriers, Sanlo, managed to deflect a torpedo with a direct hit from her 5-inch gun, while an Avenger from the same carrier strafed another and detonated it in the water. The rest ran for so long that the carriers had plenty of time to spot them coming and turn away. Johnston, battered and down to one engine with no torpedoes left, had just disrupted an entire Japanese destroyer squadron and saved the carriers from a coordinated torpedo attack. Watching it all unfold, Commander Evans, standing on his wrecked bridge, actually chuckled at what his ship had just pulled off, saying, quote, "Now I've seen everything." Before Johnston's crew could celebrate, all Japanese destroyers turned their full attention on them, with shells slamming into the battered destroyer from every direction, tearing through what little remained of her superstructure. Though the ship had no more power or communications, fires spread unchecked through compartments already flooded or torn open. Commander Evans, 2 fingers gone from his left hand, refused to leave his post and continued barking orders to what remained of his crew. Only the number 4 5-inch gun, all the way aft, could still return fire. Its crew operated it manually, cranking the training wheels by hand, loading shells without power hoists, firing at whatever Japanese ship looked closest. One of Johnston's officers looked out at the ocean and later described what he saw. Quote, "There were 2 cruisers on our port, another dead ahead of us, and several destroyers on our starboard side. Now completely surrounded, Japanese warships circled the dying destroyer, pouring round after round into her hull. All the while, that single gun kept firing. At 9:40 a.m., Johnston's engines finally quit, and Evans knew there was nothing left to do. 5 minutes later, he gave the order to abandon ship. Men scrambled over the side and jumped into the sea as shells continued to fall around them, some hitting so close that the concussions injured swimmers in the water. Half an hour later, Johnston slipped beneath the waves. As the destroyer vanished, the captain of one of the Japanese destroyers, watching from his own bridge, slowly raised his hand in somber salute. The Americans weren't the only ones taking losses. Heavy cruisers Chokai and Chikuma had both gone down under air attacks earlier in the morning, but Kurita still had more than enough firepower to finish Taffy 3, and the battered American ships couldn't hold on much longer. Then, at 9:25 a.m., while Sprague stood on Fanshawe Bay's bridge, dodging incoming salvos, one of his signalmen suddenly shouted, quote, "God damn it, boys, they're getting away." The Admiral looked up and couldn't process what he was seeing. The entire Japanese fleet was turning away, heading north. He later admitted it took reports from circling aircraft to convince him it was really happening. In reality, Kurita ordered his scattered warships to break off the attack. He'd heard Taffy 3's desperate, plain-language distress calls and received reports of another American carrier force spotted north of Samar. Powerful reinforcements had to be on the way. That afternoon, he confirmed to Tokyo he was abandoning the attack on Leyte Gulf and heading north to engage this new threat. Of course, the task force he went searching for was never there, and Kurita, driven by smoke and fear, turned away from the undefended invasion beaches, chasing ghosts while victory slipped through his fingers. During the Battle off Samar, the last major surface engagement of the Pacific Theater, Taffy 3 had held the line. 6 escort carriers and 7 screaming ships, outnumbered and outgunned, had turned back the most powerful surface fleet Japan could field. Johnston, Hull, Samuel B. Roberts, and Gambier Bay were gone, along with over 1,000 men, but the invasion beaches were safe. Writing about Taffy 3's fight, historian Samuel Eliot Morrison stated, quote, "In no engagement of its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in those 2 morning hours between 07:30 and 09:30 off Samar." For his actions that day, Commander Ernest E. Evans, who had charged Johnston into a fleet of battleships and never backed down and went down with his ship, was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in U.S. Navy history to receive it.